I'm Emma Collins, 32 years old, a financial advisor in Chicago. And the moment I held table card number 18 at my sister's wedding, I knew I'd just been cast into another act of a familiar play. Public humiliation disguised as family tradition. Every guest was seated in the grand center hall of the Boston Public Library under glittering chandeliers surrounded by white roses and soft classical music. And me? My parents placed me by the entrance right next to the catering trays where suitcases rolled by and waiters constantly passed, blocking my view. From that cold corner, I watched Sophia, my radiant little sister, glow in her wedding gown, adored like a Disney princess. Maybe this moment was just another chapter in the same book I'd been forced to read since childhood, where Sophia, the younger sister by 3 years, was the gift wrapped in shimmering paper, and I was the shadow beside her, always expected to carry the weight without ever being praised. Even as a child, I noticed the subtle difference in every glance and word my parents spoke. Sophia was their sweet little princess, while I was the strong big sister who has to set an example. It sounded noble, even loving, but beneath those words was a quiet truth. I was meant to sacrifice so she could shine. When Sophia fell off her bike, the whole house rushed to her side. When I burned with fever, my mother just left a bowl of porridge on the table and said, "You're older now. You can handle it." At family gatherings, the favoritism became impossible to ignore. Relatives would orbit around Sophia like bees drawn to honey. All she had to do was smile and everyone would gush. "She's such a charming girl." I, on the other hand, was always greeted with the same tired questions. "When are you getting a boyfriend? When are you getting married?" They rarely asked about my career or my dreams. What mattered to them was whether I had fulfilled the so-called duty that society expected from a woman. Sophia only had to show up in a new dress or with a different hairstyle to become the center of attention. I learned to stay quiet, to swallow the humiliation and smile as if it didn't matter. But deep down, the wound never healed. In high school, I won first place in the Illinois State Speech Competition. Standing on stage holding that certificate, I imagined my parents' arms around me, their faces lit up with pride. But when I brought it home, my mother simply nodded and said, "Good job, honey," before turning to ask Sophia how school was and whether anyone had teased her. My father flipped through his newspaper and said, "I heard Sophia sang at her elementary concert. Everyone loved it." My joy faded into a hollow silence. No matter how hard I tried, my achievements were always treated like passing breezes, while Sophia's smallest accomplishments were celebrated like grand victories. By the time I entered college, the difference had become undeniable. I chose finance, worked tirelessly, and earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University. For 4 years, I balanced classes and part-time jobs so my parents wouldn't have to worry about expenses. On graduation day, I stood on stage in my cap and gown, scanning the crowd for their familiar faces. They did come, but when I called to ask for a photo together, my mother smiled faintly and said, "We can't, honey. Sophia has her ballet recital tonight, and we'll be late if we don't leave now." They walked away, leaving me with my honors diploma in hand and a cold emptiness inside. The most important day of my life, and once again, I lost to one of Sophia's performances. Throughout my adult years, the same story kept repeating itself. When I was promoted to senior associate at my first financial firm, my mother's only question was, "But you're still single, aren't you?" When I bought my first condo with my own money, my father muttered, "A big house means nothing for a woman who lives alone." Meanwhile, Sophia only had to date a wealthy man for a few months before the entire family would gush, "He's such a perfect match. He fits right in with our family." The peak of their favoritism came when Sophia got engaged to Mark Reynolds, her now husband. I still remember that day vividly. My mother called me with a thrill in her voice I'd never heard before. "Emma, wonderful news. Sophia's going to be a Reynolds bride. She's truly the pride of our family." I stayed silent, managed a quiet congratulations, but inside my heart cracked. In that moment, I understood. In my parents' eyes, the future of our family didn't rest with me. The daughter who was independent, hardworking, and resilient. Every expectation, every ounce of belief, even their love, seemed poured entirely into my sister. They didn't even try to hide it. They told the relatives outright, "Sophia is the true future of the Collins family. She's our real pride." I sat at the dinner table, each word striking like a hammer. I remember one evening my father turned to me and said with casual certainty, "Emma, you may be successful, but a woman isn't complete until she's married. Look at Sophia. She knows how to choose the right man. That's why she's where she is now." I bit my lip, swallowing the bitterness that rose in my throat. They didn't realize those words were pushing me farther to the edge of my own home, making me a stranger among my own blood. All of those memories swirled in my head during Sophia's wedding. Every polite smile, every pitying glance from the guests tonight felt like an echo of what I had endured for decades. The music shifted into a solemn melody as the grand wooden doors swung open. I lifted my head and every gaze in the hall seemed to turn toward Sophia. She appeared in a pristine white gown, the long veil trailing across the red carpet, the crystal chandeliers above scattering light over the lace like a halo. The entire room fell silent for a few seconds before gasps of admiration rippled through the crowd as if a Disney princess had just stepped out of a fairy tale. I watched my sister glide down the aisle, her smile radiant, her every step deliberate, moving toward Mark waiting at the altar. And in that moment, I felt like a stranger sitting among my own family, a spectator to a life I had never been allowed to live. It was a feeling both familiar and painful because deep down I knew I had never been and perhaps would never be seen with that same admiration. The ceremony unfolded flawlessly. Every detail perfectly orchestrated: the priest's gentle voice, the readings, the soft piano chords filling the air. Guests teared up as Sophia and Mark exchanged vows and sealed them with a kiss amid thunderous applause. I sat quietly, my eyes fixed on them, my heart heavy with emptiness. They say a wedding is the happiest day of a bride's life, but for me, it was the day when the divide between me and my family became impossible to ignore. After the ceremony came the reception. I thought I could simply sit in my corner, eat a little, and leave quietly. But Sophia, never one to miss a scene, had other plans. When the MC invited the bride and groom to introduce their families to Mark's relatives, Sophia grabbed my hand and led me toward the main table where his family sat. For a moment, I froze under the weight of dozens of curious eyes. Sophia smiled sweetly, but behind that smile flickered the same calculating spark I'd known all my life. Then in a clear voice, she said, "This is my sister, Emma. She's devoted her whole life to work. No one's ever shown much interest in her." The room went silent for a heartbeat. Then polite laughter trickled out. A few people smirked awkwardly. Others exchanged sympathetic glances. I caught the whispers. "Oh, so she's not married yet? That's unusual." Someone even shook their head as though I were a living tragedy. I forced a smile, gripping my glass tightly to stop my hands from trembling. Then the advice began to fall like rain. One of Mark's aunts tilted her head toward me and said in a tender voice, "You're so beautiful. Why not try joining a few dating groups? There are plenty of good men in Boston." Another relative chimed in. "Maybe you should let Sophia introduce you to someone. She must know lots of decent men." A family friend laid a gentle hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't worry. Sometimes love comes later and lasts longer. Don't lose hope." Each word, though wrapped in kindness, cut into me like a blade. They didn't see me as a grown independent woman with a solid career. They saw me as someone lost, a case to be saved. No one asked how much I loved my work or what I had achieved on my own. No one cared about the resilience I had built, starting from nothing. In their eyes, my worth was measured only by whether I had a husband. Sophia stood there smiling, letting the pity swirl around us, even nodding in agreement. "Yes, Emma really does need someone. I just hope she finds happiness soon." Her voice was full of saintly concern, but I heard the mockery hiding beneath each word. All my life, she had known exactly how to make herself look like the angel and me like the pitiful one. I tried to find a way to slip out. I nodded through the small talk, gave thin smiles, but the pitying looks clung to me like a web I couldn't escape. A middle-aged man even launched into a story about a newly divorced colleague looking for a partner, as if I were some commodity to be matched up. Heat rose to my face. My heart thudded. And all I wanted was to turn and run. But my feet felt glued to the carpet. In that moment, I understood that Sophia had achieved exactly what she wanted. She didn't just have the lavish wedding with the ideal husband our parents adored. She had turned the reception into a stage to publicly diminish me before her new in-laws, before hundreds of guests. Every pitying glance sent my way was another brick building her pedestal higher. And my parents, sitting nearby, only smiled in quiet satisfaction, as if everything were unfolding according to a script they'd long rehearsed. I bit my lip hard, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. Just then, the music shifted into an upbeat rhythm, and the DJ's voice boomed with excitement. "Single ladies, come on up. It's time for the bride to throw the bouquet." Applause erupted, cheers echoing across the hall. I shuddered, hoping I could stay seated, blend into the shadows, and avoid being dragged into this pointless spectacle. But luck wasn't on my side. One of the bridesmaids, Sophia's close friend, suddenly came over, grabbed my hand, and chirped, "Come on, Emma. This is your chance." I shook my head, but she tugged harder, pulling me to my feet under the applause and stares of hundreds of eyes. Before I could protest, I was already pushed to the center of the dance floor, surrounded by a circle of young women in shimmering evening gowns and bright red lipstick. They giggled, posed for photos, and adjusted their hair, each one glowing with anticipation for the lucky moment. I stood there frozen, feeling utterly out of place, like a fool caught under the spotlight. My whole body felt exposed to the crowd, and the cruel truth echoed in my mind. I wasn't there because of joy or excitement, but because of pity. Sophia turned her back, clutching a bouquet of white roses, the symbol of romantic fortune. I saw her shoulders tremble slightly, as if she were savoring the game. Then, as the DJ began to count down, 3, 2, 1, Sophia suddenly glanced over her shoulder, locking eyes with me for a brief, piercing second. In that look, there was no sisterly affection, only a cold, mocking satisfaction. And then, instead of tossing the bouquet toward the circle where I stood, she flicked her wrist sharply in the opposite direction, sending it sailing neatly into the hands of another woman standing far across the room. The hall erupted with cheers, applause, and laughter rolling through the air like a wave. A sharp voice cut across the noise from somewhere in the crowd. "Looks like Emma will be single for many more years." I caught more whispers. "Poor thing. But it's kind of funny. She's probably used to it by now." Even though the words weren't aimed directly at me, they pierced like blades sinking deep into my chest. My face burned, my hands clenched into fists, but I had no idea how to react except to stand frozen in the middle of the floor. In that moment, I felt my loneliness more clearly than ever. Every guest, relatives, friends, old family acquaintances was witnessing me being turned into entertainment. They looked at me with a mix of pity and thinly veiled amusement as if they were watching a cheap comedy play out. And Sophia, my own sister, stood on the stage in Mark's arms, wearing a triumphant smile. I wanted to scream, to run outside, but my legs wouldn't move. I turned my face away, swallowing back the tears that threatened to spill. I didn't want any of them to see me cry. Inside though, my heart felt like it was shattering into 100 pieces. Why did I have to endure this? Why did choosing a different path, independence, self-reliance, a focus on my career turn me into a failure in the eyes of my family and the entire room? As the DJ kept the crowd energized, I slipped quietly out of the circle and made my way back to my table. Every step felt heavy, the echo of laughter and whispered mockery still ringing in my ears. I sank into the cold chair, lifting my glass of wine to my lips, but my hand trembled and the liquid rippled over the rim. The clinking of glasses and cheerful chatter filled the hall. Yet all of it only made me feel more isolated. I had endured enough for one evening: pitying looks, snide remarks, the humiliating bouquet toss. I no longer wanted to stay a second longer. Setting my glass down, I drew a deep breath, then rose slowly and began walking toward the door. One thought pulsed in my mind. "Leave this place, Emma. There's nothing here for you." But just as my hand reached for the grand wooden door, a warm baritone voice rang out behind me so clear it stopped me in my tracks. "If you walk away, they win." I turned, my heart skipping a beat. He was standing a few steps away, tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, the golden light reflecting off the sharp lines of his face. His deep blue eyes held mine without blinking, steady and resolute. His voice came again, calm yet firm. "Give me a chance." For a moment, I was too startled to speak. My thoughts tumbled. Who was he and why did he care? But before I could react, the man stepped closer and extended his hand, his palm warm and sure. "David Miller," he said simply, a faint smile touching his lips. "And tonight, if you'll let me, come back into the hall with me. You won't have to be alone anymore." My hand trembled, hovering for a few seconds. Every instinct urged me to pull back, to retreat, to shield myself from yet another cruel joke. But his eyes held me still. They weren't like the pitying stares I'd endured all night. In them, I saw steadiness, trust, and something that felt almost like respect, a feeling I hadn't experienced in so long. At last, I placed my hand in his. In that instant, a warm current ran through me, chasing away the cold that had clung to me since I'd walked into the wedding. David's grip was gentle but sure, as he turned and led me back toward the center of the hall. We moved as if we'd known each other for years, as if I wasn't the lonely outcast anymore, but a guest of honor, accompanied by a man brimming with quiet confidence. As we walked past the rows of tables, I could feel the guests' eyes following us. Some whispered to each other, others raised their brows in surprise. They had just seen me dragged out as a spectacle. Now they were watching me return with a poised stranger at my side. I caught snippets of murmurs. "Who is that? Does Emma have someone with her?" The shift in the room's energy made my heart beat faster, part nerves, part something strangely like joy. David pulled out a chair and gestured for me to sit at a table near the center, far from the cold corner where I'd been left. When I hesitated, he leaned in and murmured, "Go on. This is where you belong." I sat down, still self-conscious. But for the first time in this endless evening, I felt as though I was no longer invisible. I still couldn't quite believe what was happening. Just minutes ago, I was the lonely woman everyone laughed at. And now here I was sitting near the center of the hall beside a man who radiated calm confidence and more importantly treated me like someone with real worth. David leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady on me. He lifted his glass, took a sip, and asked in an easy tone, "So, Emma, how long have you been working in finance?" I blinked in surprise. Usually, Questions about me began with, "Why aren't you married yet?" Or, "Is there someone special?" But this was different. He was asking about my work, about what I had built for myself. I hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "Over 10 years now. I started as a data analyst and eventually became an advisor for small and mid-sized businesses." I stopped, half expecting his interest to fade like it always did when people realized I was more focused on my career than on marriage. But David tilted his head slightly, his eyes brightening. "That's impressive," he said. "Thriving in that field in Chicago isn't easy. It means you're disciplined and resilient." Something caught in my throat. Not because of the compliment, but because it was the first time in years that someone had noticed the very things I'd always wished others would see. I smiled faintly, a warmth rising quietly inside me. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. David didn't stop there. He asked about my recent projects, about the toughest challenges I'd faced in my work. I told him about the time I advised a struggling startup that was on the brink of collapse and how I helped them restructure their finances and secure new investors. He listened intently, never interrupting, his focus unwavering. When I finished, he nodded, genuine admiration flickering in his eyes. "That's a skill most entrepreneurs wish they had," he said. "You know, stories like that make me want to work with people like you more than anyone else." I couldn't help but laugh softly, a mix of shyness and relief in my voice. For as long as I could remember, every conversation within my family had ended with lines like, "That's nice, but when are you getting married?" Or, "What's success worth if you have no one to share it with?" But now, for the first time, someone saw me for who I truly was, a self-sufficient woman, complete in her own right. As we talked, I began to notice a shift around us. The guests' eyes started drifting toward our table. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Who is he?" "I think he's one of the groom's business partners." "Does Emma have a secret boyfriend?" A few people glanced over with thinly veiled curiosity, even surprise. The image of me as the lonely, overlooked sister was starting to fade. In its place, I could feel a new story taking shape. One where I was no longer the outcast, but the center of a quiet, intriguing mystery. I caught sight of a few young women, the same ones who had giggled when I was dragged out for the bouquet toss, now looking at me differently. There was curiosity in their eyes, even a trace of envy. I overheard one whisper, "They actually look good together." My heart stirred, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because for the first time, I didn't feel like the joke in the room. And then I met Sophia's gaze. She stood beside Mark, her smile tight and brittle, but her eyes, they had hardened. She looked straight at me and David, her expression momentarily slipping out of control. For the first time, I saw her unsure, unsettled, maybe even angry. I won't deny the quiet satisfaction that moment brought me. For years, Sophia had always been the star while I was the shadow. She was used to being the center of every spotlight, to turning me into the backdrop that made her shine brighter. But now at her own wedding, someone's attention had shifted to me. And not just anyone's, but a man whose presence commanded the room, whose attention made people notice. David seemed to sense the change in the air. But he kept his composure, continuing our conversation with effortless ease. He asked about Chicago, about what it was like to live alone in a big city. I told him about my small apartment, my early morning runs along the river, the quiet joy of arranging my own life on my own terms. He listened and smiled, his voice steady and sincere when he said, "You know, that kind of independence isn't something everyone has. It's something to admire, not something to pity." Hearing him say that made my nose sting and my eyes blur. His words felt like a balm on a wound I had carried for years. I nodded, smiling faintly, trying to hide the rush of emotion. But inside, I knew I had just stumbled upon something rare. Recognition. The atmosphere at the table kept shifting. A few guests began coming over, introducing themselves, asking polite questions. They were curious about David, and through him, they were seeing me in a way they never had before. I could feel the whispers changing tone from pity to surprise, from mockery to curiosity. And when Sophia swept past, flashing a brittle smile at the guests, I knew she could feel the heat of this shift as well. My heart pounded, but no longer with shame or humiliation. For the first time all evening, I felt I had a place. The music changed to a romantic ballad, soft piano notes rippling through the hall. The lights dimmed, focusing into shimmering streams of gold at the center of the dance floor. David set his glass down and turned to me, his eyes glinting as if he had made up his mind. He tilted his head slightly, offering his hand with a gentle yet confident smile. "Emma," he said softly, "would you like to dance with me?" I froze. All my life, I had been the one on the sidelines, watching others bask in the spotlight, never imagining I'd be the one stepping into it. I almost shook my head, ready to refuse, but David's eyes stopped me. There was no pressure in them, only an honest invitation, as if he truly wanted to share this moment with me. I took a deep breath, then placed my hand in his. He led me to the center of the floor. Instantly, the spotlight beamed down on us, drawing every gaze in the room. I heard the rustle of chairs, soft murmurs, even a few small cheers from the guests. The sensation was overwhelming, part fear, part exhilaration. But when David's hand settled gently on my waist, and he guided me through the rhythm, the tension melted away. His movements were steady, assured, each step leading me effortlessly, as if he'd been preparing for this moment all his life. And for the first time in years, I felt beautiful. I felt seen right there under the same light that had always belonged to someone else. But that fragile joy didn't last long. From the edge of the dance floor, Sophia suddenly appeared. Her radiant smile was perfectly intact, her face still that of the flawless bride, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She walked straight toward us, her tone sweet but strained. "Mind if I cut in?" she asked, her voice carrying through the music. A few guests chuckled softly, thinking it was just a playful gesture from the bride. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. This was exactly the moment I had always feared, Sophia dragging me back into the shadows just when I had finally stepped into a sliver of light. I was ready to step aside, to surrender, as I had done all my life. But David didn't let go of my hand. He turned to face Sophia and the easy smile on his lips vanished, replaced by a calm, commanding seriousness that silenced the entire room. "Actually, yes," he said clearly, each word ringing through the hall. "We're having a moment." End of section. The air seemed to crystallize. The music still played softly, but every breath in the room stopped. Sophia froze, her practiced smile cracking in an instant. No one had ever refused her publicly before, especially not on her wedding day. I saw her cheeks flush red, her lips tremble for a second before she quickly composed herself, forcing out a light laugh. "Oh, I was just kidding. No harm done." David didn't flinch. His gaze stayed steady, his voice firm but calm. A real sister wouldn't turn her own sibling into entertainment, especially on a day that's supposed to be about love and unity. His words hit like a hammer, echoing across the hall. I heard a few sharp intakes of breath from the crowd. Guests exchanged glances, their eyes wide with surprise. No one had ever dared to confront Sophia like that. Not here, not now. But I knew deep down that every word he said was the truth, the raw, unspoken truth that no one had ever had the courage to say aloud. Sophia stood there, her smile frozen, unsure of what to do. She glanced around the room, searching for support, but what she found instead were looks she had never received before. Gone was the admiration once reserved for Princess Sophia. In its place were stares filled with scrutiny and quiet judgment. A few guests shook their heads. Others watched her with disappointment. I caught faint whispers drifting through the air. "Seriously? She made her sister a joke." I noticed during the introduction something felt off. My heart pounded wildly. I had never imagined a day when Sophia would be seen through such a lens. I was so used to her being the shining star, the family's pride, while I remained the shadow. Yet now, for the first time, the balance had shifted, and it hadn't happened because I fought back, but because a stranger had the courage to speak up for me. Sophia forced a nervous laugh, trying to recover her composure. "You misunderstood," she said, her voice unsteady. I just wanted to lighten the mood, but her tone wavered, stripped of its usual confidence. Mark, standing nearby, frowned deeply. He didn't speak, but his expression was stern, like a man suddenly seeing something about his new wife he had never noticed before. David turned to look at me, his eyes softening as if to say, "I'm here. Don't be afraid." He gently squeezed my hand, then guided me back into the rhythm of the music, leaving Sophia standing there alone, surrounded by a room full of judging eyes. My throat tightened and tears welled up, but this time not from humiliation. They came from something I had never felt before: protection. Someone had finally stood up, refusing to let me face the cruelty alone. When the song ended, applause rippled through the hall as David led me off the dance floor. We started back toward the tables, but instead of heading for table 18, the lonely corner where I'd been exiled, David stopped and gestured to one of the servers. His voice was low but steady. "Excuse me, our table will be here near the center." The server hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure, until David handed over a business card and murmured something quietly. Within minutes, he nodded and led us to one of the elegant tables near the stage, reserved only for the most important guests. As I sat down, my heart pounded in my chest. It felt as if I had just crossed an invisible threshold from the forgotten shadows to the bright center of the room. The change wasn't only about where I was seated. It was in how people looked at me. Guests who had avoided eye contact earlier were now smiling, approaching, striking up polite conversation. A middle-aged man from the groom's family shook my hand warmly. "Emma, right? I heard you work in finance. Fascinating. We should talk sometime." A young woman, one of Sophia's friends, leaned in with a grin. "You and David look amazing together. How long have you two known each other?" I blushed, searching for an answer. But David stepped in smoothly, his eyes gleaming with quiet humor. "Long enough to know I'm very lucky," he said. His words drew soft laughter from the table, and for the first time, I felt a rush of pride. Not the empty kind I had been told to fake, but the real kind that comes from finally being seen. Slowly, the atmosphere around me began to change completely. From the woman people pied, I became the center of curiosity and attention. I noticed approving nods, reassessing glances, and whispered remarks rippling through the room. "So Emma's not as ordinary as we thought. Maybe we've been seeing her wrong all along." Meanwhile, Sophia struggled to maintain her radiant bride smile as she chatted with guests. But I could see the tension in her face. Her eyes never left me and David. And every time laughter rose from our table, her expression tightened for a split second. Mark stood beside her, looking confused, clearly unsure of what was unfolding, though even he couldn't hide the surprise on his face. Then came the next part of the evening, the garter toss. The MC called all the single men to the dance floor, and the room buzzed with excitement. David smiled, set down his wine glass, and stood to join them. I watched, my heart fluttering with a strange mix of pride and nerves. He walked out with quiet confidence, and when Sophia turned her back and tossed the garter over her shoulder, I saw David reach up and catch it effortlessly in midair. The hall erupted in cheers. According to tradition, the man who catches the garter is supposed to kneel and place it on a woman's leg. Without hesitation, David turned toward me. My pulse pounded. Heat rushed to my face. He crossed the room in steady strides, his smile lighting up the space, drawing more than a few envious sighs from the women nearby. When he reached me, he didn't ask, didn't pause. He simply went down on one knee before me. The hall fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in cheers and whistles. I sat frozen, unable to believe what was unfolding before my eyes. David lifted my leg gently, brushed aside the hem of my dress, and carefully slid the garter onto my ankle. His touch was so deliberate, so respectful, it felt less like a party game and more like a sacred ritual. My heart pounded so hard it felt as if it might burst. Shouts echoed through the room. "Woo! They look amazing, Emma and David." Guests rose to their feet, clapping, some even holding up their phones to record. I could see it clearly, the change in their eyes. Where there had once been pity and disdain, now there was admiration, even excitement. I glanced toward Sophia. She stood there, her fake smile shattering like cracked glass. Her eyes had gone dark, her lips pressed tight, the proud facade of the wedding princess slipping away. She seemed frozen, unsure how to react, while the entire hall applauded for David and me. In that moment, I realized the revenge had already taken place without me saying a single word. Sophia had built this stage to make me the joke. But now that stage had turned on her. The lights, the cheers, the cameras, all of it had shifted onto me. I didn't jump up and cheer. I didn't laugh in triumph. I simply sat there drawing a long, steady breath, letting the swell of emotion fill my chest. This wasn't just my honor being restored. It was proof that I had never been invisible, never been a failure. I had only been hidden beneath favoritism and cruelty. And now, in front of hundreds of people, the truth was laid bare. David stood, gave my hand a reassuring squeeze, and whispered, "Now they'll never look at you the same way again." I turned toward him, my eyes shining, unable to find any words. Because I knew he was right. And Sophia knew it, too. When the program ended, the lights in the hall dimmed and the chatter softened as guests slowly drifted out into the marble corridors of the Boston Public Library. I still felt as if I just stepped out of a play with an unexpected ending where the side character's name is suddenly called. David lightly touched my elbow, quietly asking if I needed my coat, then walked with me down the line of columns toward the parking lot behind the building. The Boston night air was crisp, our breath hanging in thin clouds, the street lights casting golden streaks across the damp stone. I stopped beside my rental car, the soft garter still wrapped around my wrist, feeling like I was holding evidence of a night that had quietly shifted the axis of my life before I even had words for it. "Thank you," I said before I could think of anything else. My voice coming out hoarse as if I just run a long distance. "You played it so well." I smiled half joking, half trying to steady my own confusion with a safe remark. David looked at me, the corner of his mouth caught between a smile and something like protest. Then he shook his head slightly. "Who said I was playing?" He replied, his voice warm and steady, like a promise. "I want to see you again." "Really?" I blinked, my heart suddenly skipping a beat. Those words drifted through the cold night air and touched me without any trace of politeness or performance, disarming me in a way I couldn't quite explain. It had been so long since anyone used the word "see" when talking about me as a whole person, not as a role in my family's endless play. I let out a short laugh, more from nervousness than amusement. "You don't have to keep up the courtesy after tonight," I said, my thumb brushing the edge of my car key. "I'm fine. We both know the stage belongs to Sophia. I just wanted to leave without feeling smaller than when I arrived." David took a half step closer, just enough for me to feel the warmth of his suit jacket. Yet, he didn't invade my space. His eyes stayed on me, calm and deliberate, as if he weighed each word before letting it fall. "Emma," he said slowly. "I didn't stand up for you tonight to get back at anyone. I did it because when you talked about your work, about how you pulled that company back from the edge, I saw a woman who knows how to stand tall on her own. And I hate when people try to make someone like you shrink. I didn't know where to look. So I stared down at my shoes. All evening, people had looked at me like a punchline to finish their story with a laugh. But now, someone was looking at me as if I were a story worth reading to the end. The strange fullness in my chest made it hard to breathe. I began then stopped because I didn't trust my voice to stay steady. Thank you for not letting me be alone tonight." "How?" David smiled softly, the kind of smile I was starting to recognize as his whenever he had already made up his mind about something. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, glanced at it briefly, then looked back at me. "I'm flying back to San Francisco in 2 days, he said plainly. "But I don't think Chicago and San Francisco are too far apart for something worth trying." He held out his hand, palm up, patient and unhurried. "Give me your number, and this is my personal one." He took a small card from his wallet, scribbled a few quick digits on the back, and placed it in my hand. The paper was thick and smooth, the scent of fresh ink still lingering. I looked down at the card and read the string of numbers, his name, and one short line beneath it. "Call when you're ready." I let out a small laugh. "Is this how you usually do business with your clients?" I asked. David raised an eyebrow, a hint of mischief softening the warmth in his gaze. "Only when I genuinely value the person sitting across from me," he said. I couldn't help but smile. In the cold stillness of the parking lot, with the sound of electronic locks beeping and high heels clicking against the stone, everything suddenly felt strangely peaceful. I glanced again at the words on the card, my hand instinctively tightening around it. "Call when you want to be valued for real." He repeated this time not as a line on paper, but as a message spoken directly into the quiet space between us. The word valued echoed in my head, colliding with old memories of every moment I'd been told in one way or another to make myself smaller to fit neatly into the outline someone else had drawn. And then, for the first time that night, I saw a small crack of light cut through the heavy dark. It was faint, fragile, but it was real. I handed him my number, quick and decisive, like unlatching something that had rusted shut. When he took it, I noticed the corner of his mouth lift, not in triumph, but in relief, the kind that comes when something finally falls into place. We lingered for a while, not saying much. I told him about my early flight back to Chicago the next morning. He mentioned a product meeting he had with his team next week. Then our words softened into small, almost weightless things about the coffee in Back Bay, the wind off the Charles River at dusk. How he once ran the Boston Marathon, and how I run along the edge of Lake Michigan every morning. Tiny fragments of conversation, yet when placed side by side, they fit together perfectly like teeth of a comb finally aligning. At the edge of the parking lot, I caught sight of Sophia and a few relatives. She stopped for a moment, looking in our direction, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read our conversation from afar. I didn't turn away. For the first time, I let her see me without retreating. I stood still, the card in my hand, and didn't bother to hide the calm smile on my lips. David didn't look away either. He simply looked at me long enough for me to know his attention wasn't part of some performance. "I'll text you tonight," he said softly. His voice gentle, like laying a blanket over someone's shoulders. "Not out of politeness, but because I want to know you got home safely." "All right," I replied, then added after a quiet breath. "I'll text back." The word I slipped out naturally, so easily that it startled me a little. Maybe because between us, the distance had already shortened by the way he patiently said my name, looked at me directly, and never tried to mold me into anything but myself. We said goodbye. As he walked away, I heard the faint click of his car unlocking nearby, and beneath it, the steady rhythm of my heartbeat returning to normal. I opened my door, sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine right away. I leaned my head against the seat, inhaling the clean scent of new leather, and watched the night slide across the windshield like a slow, cool river. On my lap, the white garter still rested there, a soft exclamation mark at the end of a story that had always been made of ellipses. I reached for my phone, unlocked the screen without thinking. A new message had just come in from an unsaved number. "It's me, David. Drive safe and don't ever let anyone make you sit at table 18 again. Dicklow." I smiled. My fingers hovering over the keyboard for a second before typing. Received. "Thank you for tonight and thank you for seeing me." After sending the message, I turned off the screen and closed my eyes for a moment, letting that soft, round feeling settle quietly in my chest. It had been so long since hope had visited me in such a simple way. Not the dazzling kind filled with fireworks and grand promises, but the steady kind of hope that glows like a bedside lamp, small, warm, and always on, even when the whole house sleeps. I started the car, the steering wheel gliding smoothly beneath my hands. As I turned onto the road, the silhouette of the library faded in the rearview mirror along with the last traces of laughter from the wedding night. And in that moment, I understood that revenge isn't always about making someone hurt. It's about standing tall in the very place they tried to make you kneel. David had reached out at the right moment, but I was the one who had to take his hand, and I did. On the drive back to the hotel, Boston shimmered like the surface of a lake, gently stirred by wind. I thought about the morning flight, about the coming days back in my Chicago office. The reports, the client calls, the early morning runs along the misty trail. Everything would still be the same. There was no miracle capable of changing everything overnight. But something had quietly shifted the axis of how I saw myself. I didn't know what would come next, a coffee, a long conversation, or just a string of warm messages shared between two cities. But tonight, in the cold, damp parking lot of Boston, amid the old memories scattered like leaves in the wind, I saw a small glimmer of light bright enough to keep me moving forward. And for me, that was enough to call it a turning point. The months following Sophia's wedding unfolded like a quiet transformation I hadn't expected. At first, I thought what happened with David would remain just a beautiful memory, a fleeting moment between two strangers who happened to stand on the same side of a night gone wrong. But then came the messages, one after another, the late-night calls after long work days, slowly weaving into a steady, unbreakable thread that connected us. He didn't disappear after that evening. He didn't let his words fade into dust the way I'd feared. He showed up consistently, sincerely, and without pretense. During the first month, I was still cautious. We only talked on the phone, sharing stories about work and the small things we liked reading on weekends, taking walks when the first snow fell. But David always knew how to make a conversation feel warm. He never asked when I planned to get married. Never prodded at what might be wrong with me for being single. Instead, he asked, "How's your project at work this week? How did you take care of yourself today?" Simple questions on the surface, but to me, they were precious. They showed he cared about who I was, not the role others had assigned me. Then came his first business trip to Chicago. We met at a small cafe by the river, where the glass windows opened onto Lake Michigan, draped in a thin veil of mist. I was so nervous, I almost turned and left when I saw him walk in. But with just his smile and the way he pulled out a chair for me, all my tension dissolved. We sat for hours talking about the past, about our families, about the wounds no one could see. When I told him about the feeling of being overlooked throughout my childhood, he didn't interrupt or try to fix my feelings. He simply listened, his hand resting on the table close to mine, ready to reach out if I needed it. In that moment, I realized I had started to trust. The relationship grew naturally, unhurried, but deeply. David had a way of caring that wasn't flashy yet always complete. He sent me a small bouquet on the day I finished a major project along with a handwritten note. "Congratulations for not giving up." He flew to Chicago one weekend just to run with me along the lake, then took me to breakfast at my favorite pancake cafe. He remembered every small detail I had mentioned in passing, the way I liked my latte with a dash of cinnamon, the habit of reading a few pages before bed. Those little things to him were puzzle pieces that formed who I was, and he cherished each one. Meanwhile, Sophia began to show her jealousy. After the wedding, she often called me with her sugary tone, asking, "So, how are things with that man from the wedding?" Or "I heard he's in tech too, sounds like a good match for you." But I knew her concern wasn't genuine. She was fishing for information, trying to keep control, as if my relationship were still somehow an extension of her story. Once she even invited David and me to a party she hosted, clearly aiming to show off her close sisterly bond. But I politely declined. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for going against Sophia's wishes. I realized she no longer had the right to define my life. My parents at first still looked at me the same way they always had. They didn't believe David was serious. When they called, their voices carried that same blend of doubt and condescension. "Don't fool yourself, Emma. Men like him don't choose women like you." But it didn't sting anymore. I smiled and answered simply, "My life, my choice." I could hear the surprise in the silence that followed. It was the first time I had drawn a boundary without asking for permission. My work entered a new chapter as well. Fueled by the quiet confidence that came from being in a healthy relationship, I started taking on larger projects and even presented new improvement ideas to the board of directors. This time, I wasn't driven by the need to prove my worth or to fill the emotional void my family had left. I did it because I wanted to, because I believed in my own abilities. And the results followed quickly. I was promoted to lead financial advisor, which meant guiding a team of younger colleagues. When I looked at them, I saw the version of myself from years ago, the girl who thought she had to stay silent to be safe. I whispered to myself, "Never again." As for Sophia, her attempts at pretending to be the loving sister eventually became a burden she couldn't carry. Guests from her wedding still remembered the moment David publicly refused her on the dance floor, and the story resurfaced in casual conversations. Slowly, her image as the perfect princess began to crack. The more her facade faltered, the more resentment she directed toward me, but her attempts to mock or provoke me fell flat because I no longer reacted. I simply didn't care anymore. Each time she tried to deliver a cutting remark, I would smile calmly, nod, and change the subject, and that more than any argument left her speechless. I slowly learned how to enjoy life on my own terms. I joined a book club where I met kind people who didn't care whether or not I wore a wedding ring. I began spending more time on small trips, a weekend in New York, a visit to a friend in Seattle, journeys that reminded me the world was so much larger than the narrow circle of family favoritism I'd once been trapped in. And beside me, David remained, never consuming my space, but expanding it with me. One evening, we sat on the balcony of my Chicago apartment, watching the city lights spread out like a sea of stars. I said to him, "You know, all my life I thought my worth depended on how my parents and Sophia saw me. But now I realize it never did. It lies in the simple fact that I choose to live for myself, to choose what brings me peace." David didn't answer right away. He just squeezed my hand gently, and in his eyes, I saw an unspoken agreement. I leaned my head on his shoulder, and for the first time, I didn't feel like anyone's shadow. I was myself, Emma Collins, and that was enough. A year after Sophia's wedding night, I stood on a beach in California, the wind tossing my hair, the waves breaking in soft, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of a new beginning. The sky was a deep, endless blue, and the sun burned low against the horizon. David, the man who had once taken my hand in that cold, glittering ballroom, was now kneeling on one knee in the sand, his eyes shining brighter than the golden lights of Boston that night. He held out a ring that sparkled in the dying sun. But what made my heart tremble wasn't the diamond. It was the way he looked at me, the gaze of a man who saw me clearly, who loved me for all that I was and all that I had become. I nodded, tears streaming down my cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of freedom, of finally coming home to myself. Our wedding took place in a seaside garden filled with white flowers and genuine laughter. There were no judgmental stares, no cruel whispers, only friends, colleagues, and people who had chosen to stay in my life because they truly cared for me. As I walked down the flowered aisle, no one compared me to Sophia. No one asked why it had taken me so long to reach this moment. They simply smiled, clapped, and wished us well. And in that instant, I felt that I had finally stepped out from the long shadow of a toxic family. As I stood beside David before the floral arch, holding his hands, I couldn't help but think of everything that had led me here. From that humiliating moment when Sophia tried to turn me into a public failure to the night a stranger appeared and showed me that I had never truly been invisible. I had endured bitterness, learned to lift my head, and finally found myself not through my parents' approval or my sister's acknowledgement, but through my own courage to let go and move forward. And now, standing before the people who genuinely loved me, I wanted to say one thing to anyone listening to my story. Sophia once tried to make me a joke, but in doing so, she gave me the chance to meet someone who saw my true worth. Sometimes pain isn't the ending. It's the turning point that leads us toward happiness. If you've ever been dismissed, if you've ever felt invisible, even within your own family, remember this. You don't need their permission to be worthy. Your value is never lost. It's been waiting all along for you to see it and claim it for yourself.